And I'm back. Europeans are not having fewer children because of bad economy times. This book came out in 2004, so this is pretty true. This is before 2008 and the other crashes that came before that. So, as far as I know, anyone who is listening in and sort of can complete has a the term consonants, looking at a different angle of a subject. If anyone has can debunk the not having bad economic times before 24, not counting the Great Depression, and the Iraq War hadn't been fully fleshed out yet, since it hadn't been 20 years yet or whatnot. So it was still fresh. So I don't think it was affecting the economy as much as it is today. All right. These young Europeans grew up in a time of prosperity. For example, real per capita income in the principally European countries of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, was $9,977 in 1960 and $29,844 in the year 2000. The numbers are in contrast. $1995. Incomes in the former communist empire have been much harder to measure. But in these countries too, real income has climbed. Greater income, especially discretionary income, yields interesting fertility dynamics. I visited Hungary in 1965 because Hungary had a very low fertility rate and particularly high rate of legalized abortion. I asked the sociologist Rudolf Andorka what was going on. He speculated that it was, quote, Kisha vad Koshi, a play on words in Hungarian meaning child or cat. Hungarian spelling Kiksi Vogi Koski. Either way, that I can't pronounce that. Sorry, no offense. Within grim communist parameters, Hungary was doing pretty well economically. Not well enough, said Andorka. Seriously, that's the name, Andorka. I don't want to sound like I'm mispronouncing this. So that upscale couples could afford to bear and raise a second child and own a car, but often well enough to do one or the other. Many chose a car, except for certain kinds of group travel. The Cold War had made travel outside the communist bloc nearly impossible. A Hungarian could no more hop into his own car, and drive to nearby northern Italy for a week's vacation than he could board a spaceship to the moon. But if communism restricted travel and yielded low incomes, the system did provide for vacations. Some said vacations were easy to grant because the workers did so little on the job in the communist economies that they were scarcely missed. Again, anyone who wants to correct that, that's cool. Hungary is a beautiful country of 35 million square miles, slightly larger than the South Carolina's 31,000 square miles. Owning a private car in Hungary meant that someone in Budapest could drive to work during the week instead of hanging on a crowded bus. It meant that on the weekend he could drive 60 miles west to the near shore of Lake Balaton for a Sunday trip. Professor Andorka and I took such a trip through a lovely pastoral region. The Balaton itself is 60 miles long, running east-west. A motor trip to the far side could be a weekend adventure. With appropriate visas, not hard to obtain within the Soviet bloc of satellite nations. A week's vacation in communist but cosmopolitan Prague, 250 miles away, or at the Black Sea beaches in Bulgaria, was a distinct possibility. America is a crazy car country. But as nations around the world have become wealthier, it has become increasingly obvious that the desire for the liberating force of personal transportation is universal. The progression often goes from scooter to bicycle to motor scooter to automobile. Yeah, I guess Bill Gates wrote a book about that actually, called Factfulness, I guess, but I didn't really like it too much. Alright. Japan went below the replacement rate at about the same time as Hungary did, and at about the time when the word my car came into the Japanese language. The word connotated a personal possession, my own car. I mean, obviously. The, quote, child versus car dilemma was, of course, not unique to Hungary. Cars and children share at least one thing in common. They are expensive, particularly in urban surroundings. In Europe today, the cost of highly taxed petrol runs to about $4 per gallon. And, quote, child or car is an apt expression for more than just cars. What does the family decide when the choice is an additional child versus a television, hi-fi, stereo, washing machine, phone, computer, TiVo, DVD player, iPhone, online service, cell phone, a trip to the Caribbean island, or tuition to a private school, and the list goes on and on. These days, throughout the modern world, there are lots of goods and services to buy, all made easier if you keep your family small. 37 years after my 1965 visit with Andorra in 2002, I was at work with the film crew in Rome doing interviews for a PBS special called, quote, The Grandchild Gap. Here are some experts. Giorgio Benevuto, chairman of the Finance Committee in Italy's Chamber of Deputies, quote, something peculiar was happening in Italy in recent years. The number of pets, the number of cats and dogs kept in the homes has drastically increased. Multinational firms producing pet foods are booming in our country. Even if you turn on the television, you can't help but notice all the commercials for cat and dog food. This means that people miss having something to care for, to keep them company. Therefore, I think that people realize this is a loneliness problem, that is, people feel lonely even in a crowd. Older Italian woman, number 1. Quote, on the whole, people tend to miss having grandchildren, just as one tends to suffer from not having any children at all. Older Italian woman, number 2. Quote, most of them tend to devote their life to animals. End quote. Older Italian, number 1. And number 5, quote, it's true. Older Italian, number 2. Quote, yes, they tend to run their love toward animals, little dogs and cats. Older Italian woman 5, quote, dogs, cats. Older Italian woman number 1, quote, they are no substitute, however, whatever people may say. Later, we filmed in Paris. The TFR was higher than in the land of the bottoming Bambino, but the problem was still there. Some excerpts. French student, number 1, quote, it's maybe financial problems. You got to pay for studies. I think they prefer raising children in a good way and just have 1 or 2 instead of 3 or more and not be able to pay for studies and what they really need. French student, number 2, quote, the problem today is that you want to wait until you have enough money to start a family. You end up too busy and you have no time for your children. And even if you decide you want to start a family right away, you probably don't have the money to support children. So you end up waiting anyway. In my opinion, it's a vicious circle. I can agree with that. Alright. BW, quote, I don't know who BW is, by the way. If anyone's paying attention and has better memory than I do, tell me. Okay, quote, BW says, would you like to get married? French student 3 says, not now. BW says, not now, but someday? French student 4, yeah, in a long time, perhaps. French student 2, quote, Both my grandparents and my mother have always told me it was important to have my own career and my own savings and be able to assume my own financial responsibilities. Older French woman. My son has a girlfriend and his job and his apartment, and I think he prefers that stability. I think it would be great if they had kids in a year or two, but for the moment, that is not a priority for them. Older French man says, the downside is if you wait too long to have children, you are really too old by that time to have kids. Ugh. You're almost dead. In fact, you're too old to enjoy being a grandparent. It's much better to have them earlier. Jean-Claude Chesnaz, senior fellow at the Institute for Demographic Studies in Paris, says, we are living in a totally new world. Nobody I know, no demographer, no social thinker, could have imagined that societies could have come much below replacement fertility, and that so many couples would remain childless. And so young Europeans had small families, and then smaller still. If things proceed as expected, this post-war Euro-Japanese generation will live longer lives in healthier circumstances than any previous cohort of humanity. By any historical collective standard, the post-war generation has it all, or almost all. It has made individual decisions with its own best interest in mind. It wanted cars and vacations abroad. Women wanted education and career choices. It wanted its children to be well cared for and to attend good schools, and it decided to have fewer children than any cohort in human history. Individually, it apparently made sense. As a libertarian on many issues, I salute free people making free choices in free nations. But collectively, unless something changes, and changes fairly quickly, these modern nations will go through a stark depopulation or an unwanted and turbulent flood of immigration to fill needed jobs. Particularly jobs needed to care for the great expected growth in the numbers of elderly. In Europe, unwanted immigrants have typically been North African Arabs or Turks to Germany. After the tragedy of 9/11, already hostile towards Muslim immigrants have intensified. In the abstract, I doubt that most Italians, Spaniards, Germans, Frenchmen, Poles, Hungarians, Romanians, or Japanese seek a future world with their national populations on ever-diminishing number and a waning of their individual national identities. Oof, dog whistle it sounds. Though some Europeans do note that there is a crowded continent, but it will not be easy to turn around the trend. Does Russia belong in the company of developed countries? That's where it is in the UN statistical theme of things. I have two colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute who pay particular attention to Russia. Leon Aron is one. He came to the United States from Moscow in 1978. Later, he spent 10 years writing the definitive and magisterial biography of Boris Yeltsin, published in 2000. Leon travels periodically to Russia and is in regular communication with his sources there. He thinks, all things considered, that Russia is doing pretty well. He sees a Russia generally friendly to the West and to America, with democracy generally embedded, with 40% of its households connected to the internet, unilaterally disarming, with average income rising at 6% annually, with 70% of the GDP in private hands, with a flat tax of 13% on personal income that Vladimir Putin says is, quote, the lowest in Europe, and with 42 cars per 100 people in 2001, as compared to the 18 in 1990. According to Aaron, the Russians are on their way. He is concerned about the apparently growing autocracy of the Putin regime, as well as scandals, political machinations, the health problems, but remains optimistic. Nick Eberstadt also pays a lot of attention to Russia, but most of his investigations have to do with searching through books of international, national, and local data and trying to figure out what they might mean. Unlike me, Eberstadt is a real demographer. He holds a chair at the American Enterprise Institute and for more than 20 years was a visiting fellow at the Harvard University Center for Population and Developmental Studies. Eberstadt sees Russia as a broken nation, a demographic basket case, losing population by nearly 1 million people each year, with TFR of 1.14, one of the lowest in the world, slated to lose about 30% of its population by 2050, according to UN projections, and with an age-standardized death rate among men almost 40% higher today than 1960, according to Moscow's official figures. The female death rate is also up, but by much less. The Russian men life expectancy dropped by 4 years during this time. Moreover, the high mortality rates are concentrated among men of working age, aged 20 to 64, likely making future economic growth more difficult, according to Eberstadt. Checking the time, sorry. The demographer Murray Feshbach of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars notes that 50 to 60% of Russian children suffer from chronic illness. Abortion rates, used as a very common means of contraception in Russia, are very high, and approximately 10 to 20% of Russian women become infertile after abortions. I have no idea if that's true, but this is why it's not fun for women to get an abortion or be put into the position. It's a double-edged sword of, if you don't do it, you'll just have a kid rot inside of you, and you're gonna just birth a child that's dead. Makes no sense. So she has the right to make that choice either way, despite the health concerns. This is why it's not just some easy, fun thing that women are doing, okay? Even as he says that, like, in the past pages, that women are just, like, celebrating it. Pretty sure people celebrate rights with their bodies, yes. Alright. Beyond these figures is the HIV and AIDS situation. Estimates differ. As of 2002, the seropositive population in Russia seems to be in the 1 or 2 million range, somewhat more than 1% of the population. The rate of excess deaths in HIV and AIDS was about the same in Russia and in America in 2000 and 2005 via time frame, according to UNPD data. About 300,000 hardened criminals are coming out of Russian prisons each year, many of them with either HIV and AIDS or drug-resistant tuberculosis. Thus, there is fear that the rate may increase and that Russian officials are not paying sufficient attention to the situation. Considering these indicators, does Russia belong in the ranks of the most developed nations? Are Leon and Nick's views compatible? They may well be. Russia appears to be on its way from a dank cellar. It is a riven society with some young, upwardly mobile urban individuals leaving the poor and sick far behind. Well, will it stay that way or turn more egalitarian as the years roll on? It is not polite to consider, quote, trickle-down economics. After all, we've been told by generations of liberal politicians that trickle-down is feeding the sparrows by feeding the horses, but it often has worked. Russia today doesn't really deserve the, quote, more developed label, but I'd guess that it will be in 20 to 30 years. Anyway, who's going to say no to a mere label for a nation like Russia, which in 2000 still had about 850 nuclear warheads, some of them still operational? Solutions? The forthcoming dramatic depopulation of Europe and Japan will cause many problems. Population will age, the customer base will shrink, there will be labor shortage, and tax base will decline. Pensions will be cut, retirement ages will increase. Some of these problems are major. Some only seem major, but over time may be dealt with more easily than expected. But is there a silver bullet, one macro solution? In fact, there may be at least two. The distinguished Australian demographer Jack Caldwell believes that in a few decades, Europeans will wake up to what is happening, decide they want their nations to exist, and will start having more babies. That is surely possible, but it will be a slow haul. Typically, the phenomenon has been viewed on the upside. Fertility rates may sink below replacement, but populations can continue to grow for many decades because there is so much, quote, breeding stock from cohorts born 20 or so years ago, or so earlier, sorry. Consider Brazil. Its TFR is now just about at replacement and falling. But from 2000 to 2050, its population is nonetheless projected to grow from 172 million to 233 million.